Hey everyone, I just wanted to give you a quick little intro into the 411 material since I'm not here, and then we can get started. So the idea behind this is that we have a lot of different identities or things that are equivalent and equal to each other that we can kind of replace one for the other and be able to simplify with. So all these on the first page you should already know. For the most part, we've done these before way on earlier in the semester. So for instance, 1 over sine of x was our definition for cosecant of x. So we can also go backwards now, which is this might be the newer part. 1 over cosecant of x is the same thing as sine of x. So if we finish the rest of this page up, 1 over cosine of x is secant of x. 1 over secant of x is cosine of x, right? So those should just kind of go back and forth. Cotangent of x is 1 over x, and 1 over cotangent of x is tangent of x. Okay? So, like I said, that page we've done before for the most part, and you will need to have those memorized. These next ones are new. So these are quotient identities. So tangent and cotangent have a special quotient that it is equal to, and tangent is equal to sine of x divided by cosine of x. And cotangent, being the reciprocal of tangent, is just the reciprocal. So cosine of x divided by sine of x. Okay. All right, so add that to your next list of what you need to know. And then one more set of identities for today's lesson. So the last ones here are based on if functions are even and odd. So this goes way back to what we talked about first semester. You don't need to know this, but this was our definition for even and odd. If f of negative x equaled f of x, that was even, or this over here, that was odd. So what you need to know is that, yes, cosine and its reciprocal are even. All these other ones are odd. So when you see here, when you're plugging in a negative x into that function, it simplifies just to be secant of x. Versus all of these on the right side, say cotangent of negative x, that becomes negative cotangent of x. So what you see here on the right side is always the more simplified version of what you see on the left side. So if you ever see anything with a negative x on the inside, your input or your angle, you need to simplify that using one of these identities. Okay, so all the problems are going to use some of these identities, so as I go through them, you might need to reference the top part, but all I'm doing is replacing what you see here with something of the identities. All right, so here's a couple examples. So cotangent of x times sine of x. So the first hint that we like to do is say if you have things that are not in sine and cosine already, make them that. Make them into either sines and cosines. That's about as simplified as you can get. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to replace cotangent with what cotangent is for the reciprocal, or not the reciprocal function. The reciprocal is 1 over tangent, but that doesn't really get us anywhere closer to simplifying with sine. So instead of doing that, which is not a bad thing to think about, I'm going to make that cosine of x divided by sine of x. And that all is still being multiplied by sine of x, so then what ends up happening, voila, is that sine of x and sine of x cancel, and all you're left with is cosine of x. Okay. So again, if we had started that one off by saying it's 1 over tangent of x, which is not, necessarily wrong in some problems, it's just that didn't get us anywhere and get us anywhere closer to simplifying. So, all right, the next one, cosine of x times cosecant of x. So cosine of x is already in terms of sine or cosine, so I'm going to change cosecant into terms of sine or cosine. So here's still the cosine of x. Cosecant is 1 over sine of x. Okay, now those don't simplify, but when we, or like cancel, but when we put them together as one fraction, we get cosine of x over sine of x, which is the definition of the one we just used, cotangent of x. Okay. So what we're looking for as far as answers is usually it simplifies down to just one function, or sometimes even just one number. Sometimes it's just like 1 as your final answer. But you should not have a fraction left over in your answer. it should be pretty simple looking as far as your answer goes. All right, couple more. Cosine squared of x times tangent of x. So cosine squared means that we have cosine of x times cosine of x. Okay? And again, I'm going to put tangent in terms of sine and cosine, not 1 over cotangent. And I'm thinking to do that here because I see what else we have in the problem is cosine. And cotangent's not really going to help us there. So tangent is sine of x over cosine of x. Okay, so this one's honestly one of the more rare ones that doesn't simplify super far down, but I can cancel out one of the cosines on the top and the bottom, but I still have a cosine and sine of x left over being multiplied. And nothing, that's no identity, that's nothing you can simplify there, it's just cosine times sine. All right, so the next one, we've got a secant, which is a reciprocal, and cotangent, which is a reciprocal. And again, I'm going to put things in terms of sine and cosine. So secant is 1 over cosine of x. Cotangent is 1 over tangent, but again, I don't see tangent anywhere else in the problem, so that's probably not going to be helpful. So I'm going to turn it into cosine of x over sine of x. Okay. And then this is all still multiplied by sine of x. All right, so what you should notice if we've done something good probably is things are canceling. So I've got a cosine on top and bottom. They cancel out to 1. Sine of x cancels out on the top and bottom to 1. So here's one where our final answer is just 1. This whole thing multiplies to equal 1. So again, all we've been doing is replacing in terms of sine and cosine and then canceling things out from there. All right, so here's also a couple that bring in this negative x, so we need to simplify using our even and odd function. So cosine is even, so cosine of negative x just becomes cosine of x. Tangent of negative x, this is odd, so the negative is just going to get pulled out in front and become negative times tangent of x. So after that step, I still don't really see anything I can simplify. Maybe I'm going to bring this negative out in front, and I'm going to turn tangent into sine of x over cosine of x. Again, I noticed that there was cosine there to switch it to, or to try to cancel it out with, so rather than calling it 1 over cotangent, we turn it into terms of sine and cosine. Okay. So we still have this negative out in front and the sine, so final answer of negative sine of x. All right, moving on. Cosecant of negative x. Again, this one is odd. Okay, so the negative stays out in front. So I'm also at the same time going to turn it into 1 over sine of x and cosine of x. So that way when I write it as one fraction, nothing's really canceling yet. I'm just combining it as one fraction. We get negative of cosine over sine, which is our identity for cotangent. Okay. So the more you get familiar with those and just practice with them, you're going to notice those things. But knowing sine and cosine for tangent and cotangent, that comes up a lot. Okay. All right, last two I think. So again, starting with these negatives on the inside, we need to simplify those. So these are both odd, so they both become negative on the outside, negative sine of x times negative cosecant of x. Okay, so what's going to happen here with the negatives is that they're going to go to positive, so we don't really need to worry about that. Sine of x times cosecant is 1 over sine of x. So sine divided by sine cancels out, and you get 1. Okay, so one thing you might want to start noticing also is that when you multiply a function by its reciprocal, those are just canceling out. And rather than having to write this every single time, it would be helpful to notice that pattern. So when you do sine of x times cosecant of x, those would cancel out to 1. If you do cosine of x times secant of x, that would equals 1. Sorry, so messy. And if you do tangent of x times cotangent of x, that would also equal 1. Again, you can always go back and reread it out the long way and do that, but if you notice it, then you might be happy just canceling it out right away. All right, and lastly, okay, if I go back to that even odd list, we know that this one is even, so this just simplifies to regular secant of x, no more negative, times sine of x. Okay. This can turn into 1 over cosine of x, our reciprocal, and when that gets multiplied by sine of x, you can reduce that fraction to say sine of x over cosine of x, which that is our quotient identity for tangent. So, you know, most all of these, there's only one problem that this didn't work on. It was either just tangent or cosine or sine, just one function, or just even one number at the very end. So they should end up as very simplified things. No negatives as far as like on the inside. Okay. So here's a couple of hints of knowing when you're done or not, because that sometimes is tricky to understand if you're done or not. So make sure you're simplified as much as possible. You should not have a fraction. So like if you have 1 over sine, you need to simplify that to cosecant. You can't have a negative left on the inside of your parentheses. It could be on the outside and say negative sine. That's fine, but not on the inside. And most of the time it should just be one function or one number. So you do need to memorize these. So start memorizing them now. Your reciprocal ones you probably already know, but a little bit every day will be helpful for this unit to make sure we're keeping up with that.